Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Stitching Tales. I am Johanna Lundström.
And I am Malena Hjerpe.
And in today's episode, we're going to talk about something that we get a lot of questions about is, can you sew knit garments if you only have a sewing machine, meaning you don't have a serger or a cover stitch machine? So that's a topic we're going to talk about today. So Malena, have you sewn any garments on just your sewing machine when you're having a knit fabric project?
To be honest, no, I haven't, since I always had serger from the beginning, basically. I always have had that option. But there are some certain things that is better to do on regular sewing machines. So then I have switched to those like specific parts. But in general, I only sew with an overlock. So it will be great to... Now I can ask you a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Because you have more experience with that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for the first 2 decades of sewing, I made knit garments just on using a regular sewing machine. So I have a lot of experience with that, I would definitely say. And then I invested in serger around 20 years ago. Yeah. So it's I've done half my sewing life. I've done it without the serger, and so I can definitely compare a lot of notes. And yeah, I have a lot of experience sharing about this. So maybe we should talk about the pros and cons of using a sewing machine when it comes to knits. I think a big pro is that you, as Malena says, you are already it's nice to some certain things you can use your sewing machine for. For instance, if you are closing the neckband, it's nice to use a straight stitch or a narrow zigzag stitch because you get you can open up the seam allowance. So if you're sewing a project, even if it's a knit garment, you will probably end up using your sewing machine at one point or another during the process. So a big advantage of just having a sewing machine means that you don't have to thread a second machine. You can use the same thread and needles and everything for the entire project. Perhaps you have to change for the hemming, but that's a good like time-saving tool in that way. It's just easy. You have one machine and one setup, and just you need one spool of thread. So that's one of I think a big advantage, except for the fact that it's much cheaper to just buy a sewing machine than having to invest in a serger or a cover stitch machine for the hemming. But that's a good thing, you know. For ease, it's actually easier in a way to just use your sewing machine. So that's why I sometimes use the sewing machine, even though I do have a serger and cover stitch machine, because I just hate rethreading everything.
Yeah, that's a pain. And good thing is that also if you have an older home sewing machine, you don't need, yes, you need specific seams to be able to sew in stretch fabric, but they are not like advanced settings or anything, like any fancy type one that's only on the new sewing machines. Like, no, it's a basic zigzag stitch. You can do so much with that. So even though your machine is old, it's still no problem to use that for knitted fabric.
Yeah, absolutely. And even I have never actually owned a new sewing machine, and I would say even the ones that I've had that was made in the beginning of the 70s, they still had a couple of stretch seams. So even if your sewing machine is older, you will probably have, of course, the zigzag stitch, as Malena says, and you will probably have a few other options as well. So you definitely don't need a fancy machine in order to sew knits on your regular sewing machine. So that's good to know too. So you don't have to fall into the trap of thinking, oh, I have to buy this premium sewing machine in order to make knit garments, because you definitely don't. As Malena says, you just with a zigzag stitch you will go a long way. So maybe we should talk, speaking of sewing, we should perhaps talk about the stitches first, of course. If we start with the side seams, you have a few options. As Malena says, a regular zigzag stitch is actually a good start, and what I like to do, depending on where you're sewing, if you're sewing the side seam, for instance, you can actually use a narrow zigzag stitch, because most knit fabrics will have less stretch lengthwise, so it doesn't really matter if the seam in that direction isn't as stretchy. So if you of course you should do a sample and see. And when we say a narrow zigzag stitch, we mean that we decrease the width of the zigzag stitch. So it looks a little bit more similar to a straight stitch, but it still has a little bit of give. So what you can do is, of course, use the fabric do a sample and try the settings. And of course, you won't get a straight line because there will be a little bit of gaps between, the shape of the zigzag. But honestly, no one will tell, and you won't think about it either. So don't overanalyze that fact, because the zigzag stitch is just it's just great because you have the zigzag. And I like to, when I talk about stitches for sewing knits, I like to think of it as a coil. With the coil, the thing with the coil is that it is it's a spiral coil. It has coils, So, and the fact that makes it elastic is the fact that it has all these coils that runs around the spiral. So it's the same thing with a stitch, right? So the more stitch and thread you have, the more elastic the stitch will be. So that's why a straight stitch doesn't have no give in that sense, because there is no thread that can expand, which makes it so rigid. So any stitch that has a good amount of stretch, which means that it has some width in the stitches, that's a good option for sewing side seams on it. So that's just a good basic, and why you should use a straight stitch in that case.
That's a good, really good comparison with the coil. And how you actually do a test, I think it's a good thing to talk about, because then you use the same fabric, you just use some scrap fabric or something, and in most cases you sew in 2 layers, so then you should have the test in 2 layers fabric as well, and then you can sew both direction along the grain line and perpendicular to the grain line, and then you stretch out the fabric and see if the seam, like, is it? Do you feel like the seam is going to crack when you pull it in any different direction, or does the seam have more or less the same stretchiness as the fabric? Then it's a good tension, good settings on the machine. But if you feel when you pull the fabric like in any direction, like, like now the seam is more stiff, it stops, and if I pull it even further, the seam is gonna crack. Then you know that you either need to increase the width of the zigzag or do some other adjustments. So that is how you test the seam. And for some like in some cases you actually have more layers of the fabric, then you can also do like 3 or 4 layers of the fabric just to make sure that it's you get the right feeling.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And also, if you do thicker layers, you might need to increase the stitch length instead as well, because the thickness eats some of the thread, basically. So that's also a good thing to know, that you try to just experiment with the stitch length as well, and the stitch width depending on what type of seam you're using. So that's very, very good. And that's something we probably say in every episode, do a sample, because every time we ourselves skips doing samples, we usually have to pay for it. So that's why we keep saying it, keep reminding ourselves as well, because that just saves so much time. And also knit fabrics, there are so many different knit fabrics and they will behave differently. So just because this particular stitch setting worked for another project, it doesn't really necessitate. So for instance, if you're sewing, say, a pair of leggings that fabric should have a lot of lengthwise stretch, you definitely need to ensure then that the seam also stretches in the lengthwise direction. Whereas on some knit fabrics, they have almost 0 lengthwise stretch. So then you could go, perhaps even use a straight stitch or very narrow zigzag stitch, because that's not a problem, because it won't be under stress if you stitch in the direction where there is no stretch. So for instance, if you're sewing darts or that kind of details, you could go to a straight stitch just because of that. So there's no like one stitch that fits all projects. And speaking of using a zigzag stitch, there's another benefit of that, is that you can press the seam allowance open, right? That's a great benefit. So I know you, Malena, for instance, when you're sewing neckbands and cuffs, I think you prefer to use that rather than using an overlock, right?
Yeah, and to be honest, really good thing that you mentioned there, that depending on where the seam is, it has different stress to it. Like, yeah, for a pair of leggings, the back rise seam, you want that seam to be really, really secure. It has to be able to, have really heavy force like pulled to that seam. But when I sew, for example, together the neckband, the neckband is like 2-3 centimeters wide, it's not going to have any stress to it. Like, you're not going to pull it in that direction. So I actually use a straight stitch with the shorter stitch length, because then the seam becomes a little bit stretchy still. If you have a really long stitch length, then it's going to be easier to crack, but with quite short stitch length, it's still going to have a like slight stretch to it. And that, if you do it on a cuff or like the neckband, you can still, then you can press open the seam and make it really flat when you then sew it together. So yeah, in those cases, I actually do a complete straight stitch. I still, in my sewing instructions, I still recommend to do a zigzag just to be on the safe side, you know. But I actually do a straight stitch there. Confession time.
Yeah, that's why you should listen to this podcast as well, because then we keep it real, right? We always, you know, try to always, you know, have extra insurance when we tell people, but this is like the unofficial version. It's like the behind
and again,
the scenes.
And it really depends again on for the neckband. It's 2-3 centimeters, like 1 inch. It's such a short, such a short seam. But if you, for example, have a cuff that is 8 centimeters, several inches, and it's a really stretchy material, and then you, like, when you dress it, you pull the cuff, then you have some stress to that seam. Sorry. So then it actually, in that case, it might be better to have a small zigzag. So it really, again, it depends on like how that seam, what the function of the seam is. Is it gonna be stressed or not? Like, are you gonna pull there or not? So it really is case by case.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. And also some rib knits have lengthwise stretch and some are very stiff. So then again, perhaps there could also be a case to use a stitch that is a little bit straighter in those cases. So as Malena said, it's very important, but I personally don't use a straight stitch. I'm definitely one of those. I use a very narrow zigzag stitch, even for when I sew darts. By the way, if you want to, we have a tutorial on my blog dealofstitch.com where I show how to sew darts on it, and then I actually use a narrow zigzag stitch, even though sometimes the fabric doesn't have a lot of stretch, just in case. But
yeah, but in that case, I would definitely do also a small zigzag, because that dart, it's a longer seam, first of all, and it can be a little bit more stretched out compared to that neckband. So yeah, then it makes total sense to have a little more stretch seam.
Yeah. And also, so we have a couple of examples here where it's actually a sewing machine is perhaps even better in some ways than using a serger. And in our book Fit for Knits, we also show a method where you can sew darts using a serger as well. But I personally really like to use the sewing machine because I find it gets me so much control. Because that's also a good thing about the sewing machine in some ways, is that it's slow. Because a serger, the pro and the con with the serger is that it's super fast. But it also means, you know, accidents can happen if you lose control over sewing, whereas you can be really like very detailed and go slow, and especially for darts and other detail seams, it's really nice to have that control, which I love about the sewing machine. I can go so slow and just really check every stitch to make sure it's perfectly straight and aligned. So that's another good reason to use the sewing machine rather than a serger for some projects.
And when you sew, for example, the side seam, which is, let's say, a zigzag, do you do anything to the edges then? Because if the seam is not, you know, at the edge, it's 1 centimeter or something from the edge. What do you do with the edge of the seam allowance? Can you just leave it raw, or?
It depends on the project. I would say if I were doing, sewing a jacket in a fabric that doesn't fray, a knit, and if stable, I press it open, just like I would have done with a woven garment. If the fabric is stable and doesn't have a lot of lengthwise stretch. But if you're, as we are talking now, you know, maybe you have a top or a pair of leggings or something that will be under a lot of stress, it will be expand and like movement and everything, then it's much better to also overcast the edges, and then you can just use a wider zigzag stitch. So you use a straight stitch for a straighter zigzag stitch, a narrow zigzag stitch, and then you overcast the edges, because then you won't have the issue of the edges flipping back and forth. Because if you leave a jersey fabric unenclosed, not enclosed, which you say, you will have a lot of fabric curling, and the seam allowance won't be that nice, right? It will be probably a curly mess, I can assume. I have never tried it, but to me it sounds like a bad idea. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, again, really depends on the fabric, because on a t-shirt, single jersey knit, then I mean the edges are not going to fray or anything, so then I think it would be more fine to leave it raw. But just like for my own sake, it feels like you leave things unfinished. So I would prefer to actually do something to the edges. But there are also seams that look more like an overlock seam, right?
Yes, exactly. So I would say any sewing machine that is at least mid-range, that has been produced in the last 3 or 4 decades, will have at least one stretch seam. And those stretch seams, they look quite similar to the overlock stitch that you have on a serger. So meaning that it just joins the side seams and overlock or overcast the edges in one movement. So those seams are incredibly durable, and they have great amount of stretch. And there are a couple of different ones, and I just check your manual on your sewing machine. You will find what type of stitch you can use for your sewing machine and the settings for it. And that seam is about 5 to 6 millimeters wide, meaning about 1/4 of an inch, which is the same seam allowance that most overlock stitches has on a serger. So if your sewing pattern has a seam allowance of 1 centimeter to or 3/4 of an inch to 5/4 of an inch, 1.5 centimeters, then that will be less satisfactory. So in those cases, it might be better to actually remove some of the seam allowance before. You can, of course, cut afterwards, but the whole point is that it should enclose the edges. Because even if you have like a lightweight jersey, what I mean is that those have, when you're cutting jerseys, sometimes they curl. So I think that could happen to the edges unless you really put them straight. So in my opinion, I think it's better to first remove the extra seam allowance and try to keep the seam allowance to the same width as the overlock stitch, because that's the best result. I'm sure if you listeners, please share your opinions on this topic. We both have Instagram accounts, Stitching Talespod, and you can also find us on YouTube, Stitching Talespod for the video version. Please drop us a comment there how you deal with the fact that a lot of knit sewing patterns perhaps won't have that narrow seam allowance. So that's something to consider, how to fix that issue, which you would, because that you won't have the same problems when you're using a zigzag stitch. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good thing to talk about also, that usually most patterns have the seam allowance included, which means that the pattern designer has decided that it should be this amount of seam allowance. But that's just a recommendation, basically. You can have it wider or you can have it more narrower. For woven, it's quite often more, you can have it more wider, because then you have a little bit of wiggle room. If you do the fitting and you say no, I want to have it a little bit bigger, then you just sew the seam, a new seam, like you make the seam allowance smaller basically by sewing it, moving the seam further out. On jersey, unfortunately, you can't really do that, since the seams are really hard to unpick. It's so easy to, you actually destroy the fabric when you do it, either by stretching out or it becomes like small holes, which is a little bit tricky when you sew with knit. It's easier to make the garment smaller, but it's hard to make it bigger. But the seam allowance, again, is just a recommendation from the pattern maker. That's why I actually prefer having patterns without seam allowances. That's why I still stick to, when I do my PDF patterns, that I have one of the PDFs actually have both the seam allowance and the sewing lines. So there are different layers, so you can close down and like if you want them visible or not. But then it's so much easier to, if you want smaller seam allowance, for example, then you print out the pattern with just the sewing line visible, and then it's more easier to add them yourself. Or you print them out with the seam allowance and, as you said, just trim off a few millimeters or however much you want to remove. So the seam allowance, it's always just a standardization, I would say, like how much do you usually have? It's not a set rule, like you always have to have this or that amount. It's like you can be flexible with that depending on your sewing machine or your preferences, basically.
Yeah, that's very, very good point. I think that's one of, because I have a few sewing patterns for knits, and I actually have mixed a little bit. So for instance, for my legging sewing pattern, I use the narrow seam allowance that we are talking about, that has the width of a regular overlock stitch or a sewing machine overlock stitch, because that's, to me, there's only one way of doing that. You have to use an overlock seam, right, for sewing leggings. Whereas on my AV cardigan, because that's meant to be sewn in stable knits that behaves a little bit more like wovens. Then I have 1 centimeter, which is 3/4 of an inch. So you can use, press open the seam, or you trim it. So it's definitely, as a pattern maker, I definitely feel like I'm not consistent either, because I try to think like, but what's the most common scenario in this particular case? And now for the next sewing pattern that I'm launching, which is for a pair of pants for knits, I definitely think I'm going to use it 1 centimeter as well, because it's a dressier kind of knit pants. But then, of course, you would have to trim a bit of seam allowance if you're using a sewing machine. The serger is less of a problem, because you can, the knife will trim away that surplus couple of millimeters. But yeah, so that's why, Malena, I think you're one of the few that actually have the seam stitch lines or the seam lines seen. And it's also like a backstory, because we are based in Sweden, and in Europe for the longest time no patterns came with seam allowance. So it was a bit of a extra, very time consuming process sometimes to add the seam allowance. But as Malena said, you could add it just according to your own preference. Whereas from my understanding, in many other countries, like in the North America, and I think in the UK, and probably a lot of other regions around the world, seam allowance were always added to the patterns. And then we here in Europe, in other parts of Europe, we have adapted to that standard now, because we know that the market expects seam allowance to be added. But for us, this is a new development that we have to follow the expectations of the customer, basically.
Yeah, and of course it's so convenient also when you print out the pattern and the seam allowance is already included, and you can just cut along the edge. So I mean, obviously it's more easier if it's like everything is how it's, I don't know, supposed to, like the pattern fits you and everything is great, and you just it's more straightforward, definitely. But if you want to do any pattern adjustments and things like that, I feel like you lose a little bit control when you only see the seam allowance edges, because all pattern adjustments, you want to think of the seam line, not the seam allowance edges. But that's pattern alteration. We can have that discussion another time. But I actually learned something in like my teacher always learned us when we sew the serger to still have 1 centimeter seam allowance and always trim off like 3 millimeters when you sewed it, because that was, I don't remember exactly if it was because you get nicer, cleaner edges, or if it was to prevent the fabric from being stretched out. So it was still a point that even if you have a serger, the seam allowance should be still 1 centimeter. Again, this is what my teacher told me way back when I was in school, young. So I don't know if it's true or not, or if it's just something, but it like that has like stuck in my mind. So that's what I would still do. It's the way that I was taught, basically.
Yeah, so if anyone has good knowledge of serger and that kind of, we would love to hear. I'm sure there are a lot of people who knows this stuff. I mean, we don't know everything. But we try to. We're very open to get feedback, so we can share that. So yeah, definitely would be interesting if someone has more information on this topic. So yeah, that was common. So I should also mention there are two drawbacks with using the sewing machine stretch seam or the sewing machine overlock. And the first one is that it takes forever to sew because it goes back and forth, tiny stitches, hence why it has a lot of stretch, which also means that you run a little bit of risk of having the fabric getting stretched out because the presser foot and the feed dogs, they move back and forth all the time. So there's more risk for the fabric of stretching out. And the second is just as Malena says, it's gonna probably ruin the fabric if you realize that you've sewn something wrong. So you definitely need to be extra mindful with checking everything, like you sewn the right pieces together, make sure that the right sides are facing and not one wrong and what right side, that you inserted the sleeve in the right opening. So just be extra mindful if you're going to use that seam. And but if you have problems with the fabric stretching out because you don't have the possibility of adjusting the feed dogs on a sewing machine, on a serger and a cover stitch machine you have something called the differential feed, and that regulates the speed of the feed dogs, meaning that you can prevent the fabric from stretching out. Whereas on a sewing machine you don't have that option. But you, Malena, has a good tip because your sewing machine has something that my sewing machine lacks. But what is that can be very beneficial to prevent the fabric from stretching out if you have that option on your sewing machine?
Is it the pressure foot pressure?
Yes.
Yes, my favorite things to adjust. So yeah, that is really, really helpful because the thing is, like, when you have a really high pressure on the foot, it presses down the fabric a lot, and then the feed dogs comes and basically pulls the fabric forward. And if you have a stretchy fabric, then obviously the fabric is gonna stretch a little bit as well when the feed dog is pulling the fabric. So this you want to prevent by lowering the pressure, basically. So it's not pushing down as much. And this can really be depending on the fabric thickness, how many layers you have. So you can adjust it more or less like every now and then, basically. And just remember, like, this is like how it normally is. So like, okay, now I have a low pressure or now I have a high pressure. So basically what the normal pressure is. But that I can really recommend to adjust. And if the seam is stretched out, and it will basically be a little bit stretched out when you take it straight from the machine, even if you have a serger, use high steam on your iron, and just don't iron it, just press it very lightly with a lot of steam. And then in most cases, I mean, I think this is like really fascinating for me, like how much it can be improved. Like the knitted fabric, it basically goes back to its original shape. So it's a huge difference. And I think this is like the biggest, if the hone sewn look, that the seams are a little bit not looking so nice, it lacks a good pressing. So that it will do wonders to your garment. So don't skip the pressing.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because you will either have two things happening, either stretched out fabric or puckering, which means that the fabric is pulled together. And both these things can often be fixed or at least minimized using a good pressing technique. And of course you have to go low heat if your iron is actually touching the fabric, and use a pressing cloth for just in case, and press from the reverse side primarily. But I agree with you, Malena, steam is a miracle worker. And I know that that is also used like in tailoring and stuff, when you're working with woven fabrics like wool to shape like the sleeve and everything. They work with steam, and it's so fascinating to see that you can use that kind of tailoring techniques just on a knit garment to achieve the same thing. And I've also sometimes put the garment on a dress dummy, and used steam and just like shaped it around that and just gotten rid of some of these issues as well. So it's definitely, so get a good iron that has like a powerful steam. I actually have a steam station now as well, which I love. I don't have a steamer, but a steam station, which is an iron that has like extra powerful steam, and it's a great tool to use for pressing these kind of issues.
Yeah, and it's very important in the industry as well. At the suppliers, like they have, if you are really a real seamstress or like this is your work, you probably have not just a regular iron, you actually have a steaming table where it's like a bigger, how do you say, iron board that actually has a suction into it. So you push down with your foot and then the how do you say, table is like there is a vacuum effect basically. So the fabric gets pulled down towards the table so it can be really flat, and then you can steam it. So it's really like, it helps a lot with that kind of a table. And in the industry, you have more or less also, for example, when you have like real knitted garment, you have this iron shape that you pull on the garment on, and then you steam it on that so it gets like the proper shape. So this is something that they do a lot in the industry because it has that big effect. So don't skip it if you sew at home.
Yeah,
I'm really passionate about iron.
Yes, I know that.
Steaming and the iron.
Steaming and
my favorite tool.
Yeah. Yeah, we love, because that's something we don't really talk about so much, and you don't see that in instruction as well. The value of actually pressing and it's as you go, and that's something you always bring up, and it's such a valid point. And so keep that in mind, that even though you're sewing in knit garments, you should still press as you go, just to ensure that everything looks like nice and flat and professional. So those were two common like side seam stitches. And another thing you can try is to use something that is becoming more and more readily available, which is stretch thread for sewing machine. So it's a regular sewing machine thread in polyester, but it has stretch. So and it was also, because I've just recently done a video about how to sew knits on a sewing machine, and you can definitely watch that if you haven't already, where I talk a little bit more about that stretch thread. And one of the commenters in that video said that she's actually able to sew almost a straight stitch now, and just because the thread has such nice inbuilt stretch that she's actually able to use a rather straight stitch and still have some stretch, which I think is a really interesting development and something you should definitely check into. It's very durable. It doesn't break when you stretch it out. So I have the Mettler brand, and I'm sure there are other stretch threads as well. So that could definitely be something you could look into if you only have a sewing machine. You can, of course, also use regular polyester all-round thread. That's what I use primarily myself. So you don't need any special thread in order to be successful with a sewing machine. But yeah, it could be nice perhaps to check out if you want to get that extra edge. Or
yeah, but that sounds really interesting. I only just saw it on Instagram like 2 weeks ago or something. I never heard of that before, so I was really like super impressed. Is this a new thing, or have I just been oblivious? I like didn't know it existed.
I think it's been available for a while, but I think they like come up with more colors and more brands are doing it. So I think that's a really great, and it has lots of different colors, so you can definitely find like nice matching thread. So it's not just it comes in 3 colorways. They have I'm talking now for the Mettler brand that I'm familiar with, but I'm sure other brands have come up with this as well. Another thing, of course,
you use it for the bobbin as well, then?
Yep.
Cool.
So yes, and of course then the other thing that you want to do on your garment is probably to add a hem. You want to hem the sleeves or the lower part of the bodice, or if you're using pants, you want to hem that, of course, as well. So then you have a few options. I think the most common option is the twin needle stitch, which is a needle that has 2 needles, where one It's one insert, but it's one slot, but it has 2 different needles. And on the right side, it sews a straight stitch, and on the wrong side, it sews a zigzag stitch. So you set your sewing machine on a straight stitch setting. Again, just like Malena says, a shorter stitch length will mean more stretch, because just like we talked about that coil and analogy that I spoke about earlier, because then you get also more zigzag thread, basically, if your stitch length is a little bit shorter, so it will have better give. So don't do the mistake of using a really long stitch when you're doing a twin needle, because then the fabric will become quite rigid. So again, always do a sample. There are a couple of things you should know about the twin needle as well. One thing that people might be a little bit bothered by is the fact that they might form what they call ridges or tunneling between the straight stitches on the right side. So a little bit of a bump or a tunnel. And that could be a little bit annoying. I would say that it depends on the fabric. If you're using a very lightweight, stretchy jersey fabric, the risk for tunneling is much bigger. But if you are sewing maybe a firmer fabric, like a sweatshirt fabric, you won't have this issue. So it depends primarily on the fabric, not your sewing skills or your setting. So what you can do is experiment with the tension, the needle tension, and in worst cases, you can also experiment with the bobbin tension, which I kind of don't really recommend as a first resort. Maybe it's if you're very desperate, and if you have a second bobbin that you can experiment with, because those are set to be correct. And if you, for instance, have left your sewing machine on service, they usually regulate the tension on the bobbin to make sure it's right. So, but there's usually like a screw where you can adjust. But what I have done is that I have a second bobbin, which is my experiment bobbin that I use for these kind of things. So I have one bobbin that I have a professional having adjusted, and then I have the second bobbin to go a little bit wild. So I don't recommend that as your first call of action.
I'm a rebel here. I would say that would be my first call to action. I have no problems adjusting the settings of the bobbin coil. That's the first thing I would do if I had that issue. I'm not scared of it. But I understand your point. But I think it's really easy to see if the tension of the bobbin is correct or not. And that is when you have the bobbin in the case, and then you have a loop or a thread. And then when you just hold it, the loop or the, how do you say, the casing that is outside,
the bobbin case.
It shouldn't drop. But if you do a little bit like move your fingers up and down like a JoJo or something, then the case should be like dropping. It's a little bit easier to explain now. I'm very visual here now on YouTube. So then for me, like, I think it's really easy to see if your setting is it too tight, like nothing happens when you like go up and down with your hand, like the thread is not like it doesn't give anything, or if you just hold it still and it drops to the floor by itself, then it's too loose. So it's really easy to actually find your correct settings again if you feel like something went wrong. But it's really, yes, it is really sensitive. Like you don't have to, like the little screw, like you don't have to do a lot of like adjustments. It's like a quarter or a half, like maximum, like usually you need to adjust. So it's like really, really small movements. So my recommendation is go for it. Depends maybe a little bit on the machines. On Bernina, I have never had a problem with adjusting that setting.
That's a very good point. That's why it's also good to listen to this podcast, because you can get a lot of opposing ideas. You can just pick and choose which where you want to go in this case. And absolutely, and I think you bring up this such a great tip. And I'm not sure everyone knows about this, the yo-yo thing. Because you have to like feel it, as Malena explains, when you put the bobbin spool in the case, and when you just keep it hanging like that, and you just, as Malena says, you go yo-yo, you yaw it a little bit up and down, and then the spool inside the bobbin cage should open up so that the bobbin will like fall, but it shouldn't like fall very quickly. There should be a slight resistance, so it moves down but controlled, right? It doesn't fall down. So it's hard, but when, as Malena says, if you know how it should feel, it's a very exact way of ensuring that the measurements or this tension is correct. So I think I remember learning that back in school, I think, in home economics when we had sewing. I'm not really interested if all of you that is listening or watching this podcast, if you are familiar with this method of ensuring that the bobbin tension is correct, because it's a great tool.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, when I was in school, like that's the thing that we learned, like always check the bobbin tension is correct, like before you sew. The same way as when you thread the machine, like just check that this thread is like it's suitable, the settings, because I mean, obviously the thread could be different as well. If you are using a thicker thread, then the tension is going to be much higher, and then maybe you need to loosen it up a little bit to adjust that kind of thread. Now most threads are more or less the same thickness, so that's why you usually don't have to adjust it. But in some cases, if you use some other thread for some reason, then you might have to adjust that tension. And I think this is okay, I promise I will make a short film of this, like how it should feel, and I put it on our Instagram account when we release this pod. So it's easier to see, to visualize what I mean.
That's such a great topic for a reel as well, I think. Just we should definitely add that. That's a really good point. And also, just a side note here, which probably brings back to what we learned in school, is the fact that sometimes if you keep using the sewing machine year over year over year and you don't service it or check this tension, I honestly think that because of just the wear and tear of the thread going through, that could alter the tension just by using the sewing machine. So if you're having these kind of issues, that you so all of a sudden having tension issues, if you check that, it could just, then you haven't, that doesn't mean that you even had adjusted the tension. Just by itself from use, it can alter the tension slightly. That's my experience, at least, if I don't service the machine.
And going back to the twin needle, I don't want to say based on experience, but based on experience, don't have zigzag settings set when you sew with a twin needle. It will break the needle. You have to double check that it is straight stitch settings, because otherwise, the needle is going to do a zigzag move and it's wider. And also make sure that usually your presser foot is actually, if you can sew a zigzag on it, it's like the hole is wide enough for a twin needle as well. But make sure you have a straight stitch settings. Speaking of experience.
Very good point, because obviously then it will hit the presser foot, and we know how a needle reacts when it hits the metal. It's gonna break and you might get hurt. So you don't want to have like a flying needle tip running towards you. That's scary stuff. Very good point. And also, speaking of zigzag stitches, there will be a natural zigzag stitch on the reverse side, on the lower side, but also if you're having issues with tunneling and things like that, don't try to get a beautiful stitch, a zigzag stitch on the reverse side. I think it's more important that it functions and behaves. So it shouldn't be, even though the illustrations might show a perfect zigzag stitch, in order to get the stitch lying flat and has good stretch, it might not look as like a perfect zigzag stitch. You might have a little bit of the needle thread showing through on the reverse side. That's perfectly fine. You just need the stitch to be functional. So that's also something to be aware of. And the only thing to me that you can, if none of these things are fixing this issue, is that you should use a fusible stretch stabilizer on the fabric that you fold up, the hem fold, because that gives the fabric a little bit more thickness, and as I mentioned previously, that will in most cases remove the tunneling. Whereas if you're using a wash away stabilizer, it will look flat when you sew it, but as soon as when you wash the fabric, the stabilizing that's not used to prevent tunneling. It's just a quick fix. It's using wash away stabilizer or double-sided tape like Wonder Tape. It's wonderful to control the fabric and prevent it from stretching out when sewing, but it won't fix the issue permanently, because once it's gone, and then you will have the tunneling anyway. So that's not the solution there. And of course you have to be, even if you go, obviously a cover stitch machine does a better job preventing tunneling, but even on some fabrics you will have it. And if you go to ready to wear and check, very tight fitting stretchy tops, there will be tunneling when the fabric is stretched out. It's just the way it is. It's sometimes I think we aim for a level of perfection that's very unrealistic, and sometimes I think we should actually go and check more garments in store and see that they are not like eliminated these kind of issues as well. But sometimes we get this idea in our head that everything should look absolutely perfect in every situation, which honestly is a very unrealistic expectation. So just the most important thing is that the stitch can stretch and won't break and has good recovery. So yeah, then you're good to go.
Yeah, and there is really hemming. I think it is really, really tricky, especially on really soft, stretchy knits, and especially on those like active wear, like lycra, those that kind of fabric you wear to like gym garments. Those are really, really tricky to do a hem on. Especially a twin needle hem on, then you will definitely have those tunneling effect because of the fabric. So then I think it's better to actually change the design a little bit. You can have a zigzag stitch as a hem stitch as well, or maybe you have some beautiful like more advanced seam on your sewing machine that will almost look like what do you say now? Flat stitch, like a cover lock stitch, flat lock. So it could be more like a design detail. And in really worst cases, I would say don't do a hem, do a small cuff instead. Like the cuff doesn't need to be like wide or anything. It could just be like 1 inch, like double folded, because then it's so much easier to. You can just stitch it with a zigzag. To your garment, stitch the cuff to the garment, because then you won't have any visible seams. So that could be a quite easy way to avoid having a hem completely.
Yeah, very good point. Because also it's the same if you use this very soft cotton rib knit. It doesn't have lycra, for instance. It's a beautiful feel, but it's a kind of fabric that grows when you're just cutting it on the table. So it just keeps growing and growing and growing. So you will never get a beautiful flat hem that is not stretched out when you're using a sewing machine. It can even be hard if you're using a cover stitch machine. So there's another option as well that you can use in sewing machine, the lettuce stitch, where you just embrace the fact that you have this soft stretchy fabric. So then you get like the edge of a lettuce. It's like a curved curly edge, and you can see that sometimes in underwear, I think, in like soft pajamas and tops and stuff like that. You can see it. You can do it on a serger, and you can also use it on a sewing machine. You can use a picot stitch, which is almost like a zigzag stitch. So there are a lot of different options, like more advanced options. So don't work against the fabric. Basically, you have to accept that, as Malena says. But honestly, the worst cases, I would also go for cuff. I think that's like of all the things that we discussed now, that's the easiest solution, I think.
Yeah, definitely, because then it's. You can hide the seam, then basically have it on the backside, and it's as easy to sew as a side seam, basically. So that's definitely recommend on those particular difficult fabrics.
Yeah.
You have talked a lot about, as you mentioned briefly, you made a YouTube video out of this, and I think you will link it here in the show notes, because it had really. I saw it yesterday, and it had really good, like lots of great information of how to succeed with a sewing machine. So definitely check that out.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's because now obviously we are speaking, not really showing much, even if you're watching the video version. But yeah, so if you want to get like in practice how all these kind of stitches look like and how thread looks like, then I definitely recommend you check out the video as well as a good complement to this. We go obviously more in depth here because we're speaking about an hour about just this particular topic, but yeah, that's a very good, and I've done lots of videos. I've done several videos before that also on how to use a twin needle. I've done a couple of tutorials about that on knit fabrics. And I also have another tip, which I mentioned in the video as well, is to use the blind hem stitch. Now, that is not for lightweight jersey fabrics, but if you're, for instance, using sweatshirt fabric, sweater knits, or Ponte di Roma, this kind of like heavier double knit fabrics, that's a really, really great stitch. And I use it for everything. I mean, I love it. I'm nuts about it. And the blind hem stitch is available, I think, on pretty much all sewing machines as well. So what it does is just sews a couple of straight stitches, and then there's a zigzag stitch, and the zigzag stitch catches the inside of the fabric. So it's basically a very similar, like the hand sew invisible stitch. So if you just use thread that has matching colors, and you make sure that you sew slow, and I like to use a magnifying lamp as well, because the trick is basically to catch just enough on the inside of the fabric. For instance, if you're sewing French terry, you will have these loops, I think it's called, on the inside, where you can catches the loop, so it won't be visible, and just adjust the stitch width of the zigzag, and you can get really, really beautiful result. And it also has a little bit of give thanks to the zigzag stitch. And also some sewing machines has elastic blind hem, which instead of the straight stitches has a narrow zigzag stitch, and then a wide zigzag stitch and a narrow zigzag stitch. And I show all these in the videos I've done. I also done a blind hem video where I show this. And I think that's such underutilized stitch for knit fabrics if you only have a sewing machine. So I have lots and lots of garments that I use the blind hem stitch for. And every time I do like a knit jacket or a cardigan or a pair of pants, always use the blind hem stitch. And if you have a serger, then you can also overlock the edges before, and it's going to look so nice because that also hides the invisible, the blind hem stitching.
It's a really good option for the more thicker fabric. Really recommend that as well.
Yeah, so those are the three. I think you also briefly mentioned the zigzag stitch, and that's really good as well, especially if you're having problems with tunneling. It also has great stretch. So if you can live with the fact that you have a zigzag stitch, rather than if you have this idea that you want to have it look really like professional, I think a zigzag stitch is a great option as well, because it just has that perfect. It's so stretchy. It will if you just do it wide enough, it will probably never break. So yeah, again, why are we so hung up about trying to make? I mean, the best thing is that the seam and the stitches, they work for that particular garment. And one thing, of course, even when you're hemming, you will sometimes encounter, because you're sewing across the fabric, and if we know knit fabrics usually have more stretch crosswise. Some fabrics don't have great recovery, and you will sometimes also have the hem getting wider as you hem it. And Malena, you brought up a great tip about the presser foot pressure. You can also try using a walking foot, because that can also prevent the fabric from stretching out. Another option is to use what I talked about previously, like a wash-away stabilizer, such as Wonder Tape, which is a double-sided tape that disappears in water. That will also keep the fabric in check. A tip that I show in my videos about how to hem knits, I use an awl, which is like a sharp tool where you can pierce hole. You can use that, or any big large needle, and just what I do is that I gently push the upper layer of the fabric towards the presser foot, and that keeps it in check. You have to be like rhythmic in the motion, but that also prevents the upper layer from stretching out, which can happen shifting when you're using a regular sewing machine. So just with the right techniques and trying to control the fabric, I mean, keep it firm, don't stretch it out, but also don't keep it too tight. So it's a little bit of a balance act, right? We talk about this a lot, because you have to like get a feel for how to sew with the fabric. So just with practice and use these little tips here, I think you will get a decent to very good hem just using a regular sewing machine.
Yeah, definitely. And one thing that we kind of forgot to start with is the needle. You have different needles when you sew with woven and when you sew with knitted fabric. So for the woven, it's the needle is much more sharper. It's usually the universal needle that is quite sharp. So it's like a knife. It can push small holes in your fabric. And for woven, it's fine. You don't notice it even after wash. But on knitted fabric, it can create a small hole, which will unravel then after wash and wearing. So that's why it's so important to have a specific ballpoint needle, which then is like the edge is slightly rounded. And then it doesn't create holes, but it pushes through basically the fibers. So that's really, really important to use. And then there's also something called a stretch needle. Do you have more experience with that, or?
Yeah, I like.
What's the difference?
Yeah, basically the stretch needle just has a more pronounced ballpoint, I think. And I really like to use those. I'm a big fan of those. They never damage the fabric or anything like that. They come in several different sizes, so you can use a very narrow one for delicate knits. I should also say that the universal needle, it's actually a slight ballpoint. And one person, I did a video recently about common mistakes when sewing knits, and I said use a ballpoint needle, and she said I've been doing just fine with the universal needle, and universal needle does have a slight ballpoint. So again, it depends on the project, and there's no like one way of doing it, but definitely if you are having problems with the, as Malena says, you get holes in the fabric and sometimes skip stitches, stuff like that can be prevented if you just use the right needle. I'm a big fan of the stretch needles. Both Smetch and Oregon has these brands. They call stretch needles. I think they both call stretch needles. So again, just try and see what works for your particular fabric, because as there are a lot of different knit fabrics. But yeah, definitely some kind of ballpoint for sure. I should definitely recommend.
Yeah, I've had experience with, but then I don't remember if it was actually the needle that was wrong, or if the needle, like the edge was slightly damaged. But I saw that after washing that it created holes for every step the needle had taken. So that was really annoying. It was just a pair of small baby trousers. So it wasn't a big thing. I could easily just sew a seam right next to it and to fix it. But so a good thing also to check that your needle is not damaged or anything. But that could also create small hole dents. And I think one easy way to do it, if you take your fingertip, your nail, and just scrape along the needle edge, and if you get stuck a little bit, then you know that the needle has been damaged, like there is something that you catches your nail. But if you can just run smoothly along the needle edge, you don't notice anything different, then it's okay. But that is also one thing that it's good to, I sometimes try that on my machine, just to make sure that the needle has not been damaged or anything.
Yeah, that's a really great tip. Yeah, because needles get dull, and if you do sew a lot, you can't just keep on using the same needle. It gets duller and duller, especially if you're working with fabrics that a little bit more jarring, like heavier fabric. I personally find that some polyester fabric seems to wear down the needle harder as well, because it provides more resistance. So yeah, definitely it sucks getting new needles all the time, but if you compare it to the option, as Malena says here, if the needle's damaged and you have ruined your product, that's, to me, it's a no-brainer. So I always try to err on the safe side and switch needles if I'm a little bit unsure of how in what shape the needle is, definitely. So that's a good way of ensuring good result. And also with skip stitches, that's just also a good fix, to just switch to a new fresh needle.
On the regular sewing machine, I wouldn't say it's I change it quite often, but it's like whenever I change the needle because I sew with a different like project fabric something, I usually change them up and I usually lose the original needle, so in that way I get new needles on a regular basis. But I don't want to even think about how old the needle in my overlocker is. Like that's, no, don't want to. Let's not mention that.
Yeah.
Moving on.
It's the same. I don't know why, because on a common stitch machine you also need to use fresh needles, sewing machine. But the overlocker, I don't know, because it's so powerful. It just seems to penetrate through everything, even though the needles are. It's the same for me. I'm amazed how seldom I switch needles there. So. Yeah, it's strange. If someone, an expert on overlocker or serger, is listening, we would love to hear why you can be so brutal to the needles in those machines. And on a common stitch or a sewing machine, it's such a fickle thing.
Yeah, and don't fix it unless it's broken. I don't want to touch like my overlocker since it's working so well. I'm like, no, I'm just gonna keep on doing it as long as it works well. So. Not changing that one.
Yeah.
Even though I know I should.
Yeah. So sometimes don't do as we do as we say. So, and always everything we recommend here is on your own risk, of course. Don't come after us. If we say that you should never switch needles on your serger, that's just because we are too lazy to do it.
We are lazy.
Yeah. We don't have any deep wisdom about this topic at all. Anyways, now we'll be going for an hour now on this particular topic, but so I think we should round it up. But if you have more information that you want to know about using a sewing machine, and of course recommendations, please drop us a note either on Stitching Tales Pod on Instagram or Stitching Tales Pod on YouTube, where you can find us. Any final words we should say when it comes to this topic, Malena?
Just go for it. If you haven't sewn with knits and you only, using air quotes now, only have a home sewing machine, just try. I mean, yeah, just go for it.
Yeah, it's just fabric. It's going to work out. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. I am Johanna Lundström.
And I am Malena Hjerpe.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.